Someone might struggle with something early in life and quietly decide that they just aren't very capable. Maybe they tried something challenging, and the result didn't go the way they hoped. Instead of seeing it as one disappointing attempt, the mind slowly begins to turn that moment into a label. Rather than saying, that didn't work out, the thought gradually becomes, I'm not the kind of person who can do that. This is where the problem begins, because events are temporary, but the identities people build around them often feel permanent. A single failure can become the evidence someone uses to describe themselves for years. A person who had difficulty learning at one point may decide they simply aren't intelligent. Someone who experienced rejection may start to believe they are not worthy of opportunity. A person who went through financial struggles might begin to think they are just the type of person who never gets ahead. The mind has an interesting habit of gathering proof to support whatever story it has already decided to believe. Once someone accepts a certain description of themselves, they start noticing only the things that confirm it. And if the story in their mind says, I'm not capable, then every mistake becomes proof of that belief, while any success gets brushed off as a rare exception. Over time, the story feels stronger and stronger, not because it's accurate, but because the mind keeps feeding it selective evidence. What makes this situation even more unfortunate is that the story often stays in place long after the original circumstances are gone. The person who struggled years ago may have developed new skills, gained valuable experience, and learned a great deal along the way. Yet they still talk about themselves as if they were the same inexperienced person they once were. The description that belonged to an earlier version of themselves quietly becomes the identity they carry forward into the rest of their life. It's important to recognize how powerful this pattern can be. People tend to live in ways that match the way they describe themselves. When someone constantly says, I'm not very responsible, they will often avoid situations that require responsibility without even realizing it. When a person says, I'm not the kind of person who succeeds in business, they may quietly step away from opportunities that could prove the opposite. Over time, that identity starts to act like a set of invisible boundaries. Those limits aren't created by the outside world. They come from the story the person keeps repeating about themselves. Opportunities might appear right in front of them, but they interpret those opportunities through the lens of that old belief. Instead of seeing possibility, they see something that feels unfamiliar. Instead of recognizing progress, they see something that doesn't fit the story they've been telling themselves. Think about how often people describe themselves, using information that belongs to a much earlier time in their lives. Someone might say, I've never been very disciplined, or I've always struggled with confidence, as if those statements describe permanent parts of their character. What often gets overlooked is that the person saying those words is no longer the same person who first formed those conclusions. Life changes people over time. Experiences teach lessons that can't be learned any other way. Exposure to new ideas expands the way someone thinks, and responsibilities slowly strengthen their judgment. Simply living through different situations gradually reshapes a person's abilities and perspective. Yet the description many people carry about themselves stays frozen in a much earlier chapter of their life. This creates a strange situation where someone's present ability is quietly restricted by the conclusions they formed in the past. The evidence that once seemed to support that identity may be years old, but the mind still treats it as if it were current information. As a result, the person's view of themselves becomes based on outdated evidence rather than on who they are today. Imagine a farmer who judged the value of his land based only on what it produced many seasons ago. Perhaps the soil had once been neglected and the harvest was disappointing. If that farmer continued believing the field was permanently unproductive, he might never bother planting new seeds that could change everything. The land itself may have improved over time, but the belief about the land would remain stuck in the past. Something very similar happens in many people's lives. Their skills may have grown, their situation may have improved, and their understanding of the world may have matured. Yet they still talk about themselves based on things that happened long ago. The identity they keep defending is built on evidence that no longer truly represents the person they are today. That's why it can be valuable for someone to occasionally stop and examine the story they're telling about themselves. The real question isn't whether the story was once accurate. The more important question is whether it still describes the person standing here today. When an identity is built on outdated evidence, it can quietly prevent someone from recognizing how much they have already grown. Many people don't realize how much they've actually changed over the years. Instead of looking at what they're capable of today, they measure themselves by old memories. They judge their potential by experiences that happened under completely different circumstances. Without meaning to, they carry forward an outdated version of themselves that belongs to the past rather than the present. The interesting thing is that growth usually happens quietly. Skills develop little by little through practice and repetition. Confidence builds slowly through small wins that accumulate over time. Judgment improves through experience, observation, and reflection. Because these changes happen gradually, they rarely arrive with some dramatic announcement, which is why many people don't fully notice how far they've come. Since the progress feels gradual, the identity someone formed years earlier often goes unquestioned. They continue defending it, explaining it, and living inside its limits, even though it may no longer describe them accurately. In many cases, the person standing here today has already outgrown the description they keep repeating. The real issue is not a lack of ability. The issue is that the identity they're protecting belongs to someone they used to be. As long as that old identity stays in place, the present version of the person has trouble fully stepping forward. Without realizing it, they limit their future by continuing to represent themselves according to their past. Recognizing this can be surprisingly freeing. If the identity someone carries is based on outdated evidence, then it doesn't have the authority they once thought it did. It isn't a permanent definition of who they are. It's simply a story that has been repeated so many times that it started to feel like a permanent truth. Once a person begins to see this clearly, something important can shift. Instead of automatically defending the description that once seemed true, they can start questioning whether it still deserves to guide their choices. They can ask themselves whether the person they've become is actually larger than the identity they've been protecting. That realization often marks the beginning of real personal change. When people understand that their identity might be based on evidence from a much earlier chapter of their life, they gain the freedom to rethink the story they've been telling. And when that story begins to change, new possibilities often appear that had been hidden behind the protection of an outdated version of themselves. This becomes clearer when we look at how identity often presents itself as stability. One of the interesting things about identity is that it often shows up disguised as stability. When someone says, "That's just the way I am," it can sound like they understand themselves really well. It feels steady, consistent, and familiar. But many times that statement isn't actually describing something true about the person. It's describing a story they've grown comfortable repeating over the years. Comfort can be very convincing. The mind naturally prefers what it already knows, even if what it knows is holding it back. A person might hold on to an old description of themselves simply because it makes life easier to predict. That identity becomes a kind of shelter. And even if that shelter is small, it still feels safer than stepping outside into something unfamiliar. This is where self-protection slowly turns into self-limitation. The person thinks they're protecting stability, but what they're really protecting is a story about who they believe they're allowed to be. Once that story becomes fixed, anything that challenges it begins to feel uncomfortable. The opportunity itself might be good, but it disrupts the version of themselves they've been trying to maintain. Imagine someone who has spent years describing themselves as quiet and not the type of person who leads. They repeat that description often, both to other people and in their own thoughts. Over time, it becomes the way they interpret their experiences. Then one day an opportunity comes along that would put them in a position of responsibility. Maybe the people around them see qualities they've never fully noticed in themselves. Instead of viewing that opportunity as a chance to grow, the mind immediately compares it to the old identity. The thought shows up almost instantly. That's not something I do. The opportunity hasn't been rejected because the person lacks ability. It's been rejected because accepting it would go against the story they've been protecting about who they are. This kind of pattern happens much more often than people realize. Someone who believes they aren't disciplined will usually avoid situations that require discipline. A person who says they're bad with numbers might quietly step away from dealing with finances. Someone who believes they're not capable of achieving much will often stop trying long before they've actually reached the limits of what they could do. What's interesting about this process is that it rarely feels like a limitation. It feels like honesty. The person thinks they're simply being realistic about themselves. In reality, they're protecting a description that may no longer be true. The mind chooses to stay consistent with the old story instead of considering that the story might need to change. The mind values consistency more than most people realize. When someone has repeated the same description of themselves for years, the idea of contradicting it can feel strangely uncomfortable. Even positive change can feel unsettling because it requires rewriting the narrative they've been carrying for so long. That's why growth can sometimes create a surprising kind of resistance. When someone starts showing new abilities, those abilities may conflict with the identity they've been protecting. Instead of accepting the evidence of progress, the person may downplay it or brush it off. They might say the success was just luck, that the situation was unusual, or that it probably won't happen again. By explaining away their own progress, they protect the old story. The identity stays the same, even when the evidence suggests it should change. The person continues behaving according to that familiar narrative. And without realizing it, they limit what they might otherwise accomplish. There's another way this restriction sometimes shows up. In some cases, the identity a person protects becomes an easy explanation for avoiding responsibility. If someone believes they are naturally disorganized, they might never seriously try to develop better habits. If a person thinks they simply lack confidence, they may avoid situations that would actually help them build it. In those situations, the identity quietly becomes permission to stay the same. The person isn't trying to avoid growth on purpose. They simply believe the description they have of themselves is permanent. Because they assume it can't change, they never attempt the behaviors that would challenge it. The unfortunate part is that most human abilities are far more flexible than people think. Skills grow with practice. Confidence develops through experience. Discipline becomes stronger through repetition. Many traits that seem like fixed personality characteristics are really just habits that have been practiced long enough to feel natural. When someone protects an outdated identity, they interrupt this normal process of growth. Instead of letting new behaviors gradually reshape who they are, they continue living according to a description that was formed long before those behaviors had a chance to develop. The story they keep protecting prevents them from discovering what they might actually become. Think about how many opportunities quietly pass by because they don't fit the identity someone has been protecting. Chances to take on responsibility, learn new skills, or build confidence might all be set aside because they don't match the familiar narrative. The person believes they're maintaining stability, but they're actually declining the very experiences that would help them grow. As time goes on, those limitations begin to add up. The person may not notice it happening because each decision feels small and reasonable on its own. But every time an opportunity is rejected in order to protect that old identity, the boundaries around that identity grow stronger. The story continues shaping behavior, and behavior continues reinforcing the story. The most interesting part is that the restriction doesn't come from the outside world. It comes from protecting an internal description. The person could step beyond that description if they chose to, but the desire to stay consistent with the past keeps them from doing it. Once someone begins to notice this pattern, an important realization can start to form. The identity they've been protecting may not actually be protecting them at all. Instead, it might simply be preserving a story that has outlived its usefulness. What once felt like stability may have quietly turned into a barrier that limits what comes next. Seeing this clearly can change the way someone looks at opportunity. Instead of asking whether an opportunity fits the identity they've always carried, they can start asking whether that opportunity might reveal a larger version of who they are. That small shift in perspective allows a person to step outside the protection of the old story and begin exploring possibilities that once seemed beyond the limits of who they believed they were. This shift reveals something else about identity that many people overlook. Every identity a person carries takes some level of effort to maintain. When the description someone has of themselves actually matches reality, that effort is small because the story and the evidence line up naturally. But when someone keeps defending a version of themselves that no longer fits who they are or what they're capable of, keeping that story alive starts to take constant reinforcement. That reinforcement usually doesn't show up in obvious or dramatic ways. Most of the time, it appears through small explanations, quiet justifications, and subtle choices in behavior that keep the old story in place. A person might turn down an opportunity and later say, the timing just wasn't right. They might avoid responsibility and explain that they simply prefer to stay in the background. On the surface, those explanations sound perfectly reasonable, but underneath them is the quiet effort of protecting the identity they've been carrying. When someone is defending a version of themselves that isn't really accurate anymore, they often start reinterpreting their experiences in ways that support the story. Successes get minimized because they don't fit the narrative, while mistakes are given extra attention because they seem to confirm it. The mind quietly arranges events in a way that helps keep the identity intact, even when the evidence suggests the description should probably be updated. This process ends up using more energy than most people realize. Instead of directing their attention toward learning new skills or taking advantage of meaningful opportunities, part of their mental effort is constantly going toward preserving that old narrative. In a sense, The person becomes both the writer of the story and the one responsible for defending it, even though the story no longer reflects who they might actually become. Over time, this pattern starts to influence the decisions someone makes, and those decisions begin shaping the direction of their life. When an opportunity appears that would require them to step into a new level of responsibility or ability, the mind immediately measures it against the identity they've been protecting. If the opportunity doesn't fit the story, hesitation usually shows up right away. Hesitation often gets explained as caution or careful thinking. But in many situations, it's simply the mind trying to protect the identity it has been defending. The person senses that accepting the opportunity would require them to act differently than they have before. Because the old story doesn't include that version of themselves, the mind quietly pushes them away from the situation. This is how defending a fictional identity slowly begins shaping behavior. Instead of choosing paths that would expand their abilities, the person starts choosing paths that confirm the story they already believe about themselves. They may repeatedly choose the familiar direction, even when a more rewarding path is available. Each decision seems small by itself, but over time, those decisions begin forming a pattern that guides the course of their life. There's an important psychological effect that develops when someone keeps acting in ways that support the identity they've been protecting. Behavior creates evidence, and evidence strengthens belief. When a person continues behaving according to the old story, the results of those behaviors seem to prove that the story is correct. Someone who believes they aren't capable of leadership may repeatedly turn down opportunities to guide others because they never place themselves in situations where leadership is required. They never gain the experience that would help them develop that ability. Later, they look at their lack of leadership experience and treat it as proof that their original belief about themselves was accurate. Without realizing it, the person has created the evidence they use to defend the story. The identity influences their behavior. The behavior produces predictable results, and those results are then used to strengthen the identity. This cycle can continue for many years, without the person ever noticing that the original story was never as permanent as it seemed. The real cost of this cycle becomes clearer when we think about the opportunities that may have existed outside the limits of that identity. Skills that could have been developed are never explored. Responsibilities that might have strengthened character are avoided. Experiences that could have built confidence simply never happen. Life continues moving forward, but the person remains tied to a description that belongs to an earlier stage of their life. That fictional identity quietly determines which doors they approach and which ones they never even try to open. In many cases, the person never fully realizes how many possibilities were set aside simply because they didn't fit the story they believed about themselves. Another cost appears in the form of explanation. When someone keeps defending an outdated identity, they often become very good at explaining why progress hasn't happened. They may point to circumstances, timing, or outside conditions as the reason things haven't moved forward. These explanations allow the story to stay in place even when the results suggest that something needs to change. It's important to recognize that these explanations are usually not deliberate attempts to mislead anyone. Most people genuinely believe the reasons they give. The mind has become so committed to protecting the identity that it naturally produces explanations that support it. Those explanations feel logical because they help preserve the story the person has been repeating for years. But every explanation strengthens the habit of defending that old identity. Instead of questioning the story, the person becomes better at protecting it. The same behaviors continue. The same results appear. And the narrative survives unchanged, even though it no longer reflects what the person might actually be capable of. Eventually, the identity becomes something that has to be actively maintained rather than something that simply describes reality. The person spends energy protecting limitations instead of using that energy to grow. What started as a simple description based on past experiences slowly becomes a structure that influences the direction of the future. Recognizing this cost can become an important turning point. When someone realizes how much effort is going into defending a story that doesn't really match their current reality, they begin questioning whether protecting it is worth the energy. The explanations, the avoided opportunities, and the repeated justifications start to look different. At that point, a new understanding can begin to form. The identity they've been protecting is not just a description of the past anymore. It has become a habit that shapes decisions, influences behavior, and quietly determines what they believe is possible for their life. Once a person sees that clearly, they can start asking whether that story still deserves to guide the direction of their future. This becomes especially noticeable at certain moments in life. A person runs into situations that don't quite match the description they've always had of themselves. Opportunities show up that seem bigger than the role they're used to playing. Responsibilities appear that suggest other people see more potential in them than they've been willing to recognize on their own. Moments like that can feel a little uncomfortable. The opportunity itself might seem positive, but it still creates a subtle tension in the mind. That tension doesn't come from the situation itself. It comes from the difference between the identity someone has been protecting and the new possibilities now standing in front of them. When a person has carried the same description of themselves for many years, anything that goes against that description can feel unfamiliar. Someone who has always thought of themselves as cautious might suddenly find themselves in a position where bold decisions are required. A person who has long believed they are unprepared may discover that others are starting to rely on their judgment. In moments like these, the person is standing at an important crossroads between the past and the future. The past is represented by the identity they've carried for years. The future is represented by the opportunity that suggests they might be capable of more than they once believed. The mind has to decide whether to stay loyal to the familiar story or to consider the possibility that the story is no longer complete. Many people naturally move back toward the familiar description because it feels predictable. Accepting the new possibility would require them to rethink how they've defined themselves. That kind of shift can feel unsettling, even if the new direction offers more growth and opportunity. But these moments are often the first signs that the identity someone has been protecting might no longer match their real potential. When life starts presenting situations that stretch beyond the old description, it's often a signal that the person has already developed abilities that their story hasn't caught up with yet. Growth usually shows up in this quiet way. The world begins responding to the person someone is becoming, even while that person still describes themselves based on who they used to be. The opportunity appears first, and the realization tends to come later. Think about how often someone surprises themselves by handling a responsibility they once believed was beyond them. Something that once felt intimidating suddenly seems manageable. A conversation that once would have caused hesitation now feels completely natural. The person begins to notice that they're responding differently than they would have years earlier. Experiences like that reveal something important. The abilities that once seemed far away have slowly moved closer through time, repetition, and experience. The person standing here today isn't the same person who first formed the identity they've been carrying. However, noticing that change requires paying attention. If someone stays completely committed to the old narrative, they may overlook the evidence of their own growth. They might treat new successes as temporary or explain them away as unusual circumstances instead of recognizing them as real signs of development. The gap between identity and potential often shows up as a mild contradiction. A person might say, "I'm not very good at handling responsibility," while at the same time managing situations that clearly show responsibility. Someone might say, "I'm not confident," even though their actions show increasing confidence in everyday situations. Those kinds of contradictions actually provide valuable information. They suggest that the identity being protected may have fallen behind the reality of how the person has grown. The description that once felt accurate may now be incomplete, or possibly even misleading. Recognizing that gap can be a powerful moment because it gives someone the chance to reconsider the story they've been telling about themselves. Instead of assuming the old description still has to be true, they can begin looking more carefully at their current behavior and abilities. Often the evidence of growth has been there for quite some time, but it went unnoticed because the person was focused on staying consistent with the past. Once they start paying attention to what they're actually doing in the present, they may realize that their capabilities have quietly expanded beyond the limits of the old identity. This realization doesn't require some dramatic moment or sudden transformation. It simply requires being honest about what's already happening. The person acknowledges that the identity they once carried may have made sense in an earlier chapter of their life, but it may no longer describe the person they've become. In many situations, this recognition appears gradually. Someone begins noticing small moments where their behavior no longer matches the limitations they once believed about themselves. They start realizing that the old description doesn't fully explain the way they're responding to situations anymore. As that awareness grows, the identity that once felt fixed begins to loosen. The person starts to see that the story they protected for years was never meant to define them forever. It was simply an interpretation of earlier circumstances rather than a permanent definition of who they had to remain. When someone reaches this point of awareness, they're standing at the edge of an important shift. They begin to understand that the identity they've been protecting may not be the most accurate description of who they are today. The person they've become may already be capable of more than the story has ever allowed them to see. Once that realization begins to take hold, an important choice appears. That choice isn't about pretending the past never happened or trying to erase earlier experiences. The real question is simply whether they want to keep living according to a description that belonged to a different stage of their life. A lot of people assume identity has to be something permanent. They think that once they accept a certain description of themselves, that label has to stay attached to them forever. But in many cases, identity is really just a summary of past behavior and past circumstances. When behavior and circumstances change, the summary eventually needs to change too. That's why the healthiest identities tend to be flexible rather than fixed. Instead of being rigid labels, they act more like descriptions that evolve over time. As a person grows, learns new things, and develops new abilities, their identity can shift along with them. When someone allows that process to happen, they stay connected to their current potential instead of being restricted by conclusions they formed years earlier. Letting go of an outdated identity doesn't mean rejecting everything that happened in the past. The past still holds valuable experiences and lessons, that helped shape the person. What changes is the belief that those earlier chapters must continue defining who the person will be going forward. The farmer who once experienced several poor harvests doesn't pretend those difficult seasons never happened. Instead, they study what went wrong and use that knowledge to improve the next planting. The earlier experience becomes useful instruction rather than a permanent prediction about what the land will always produce. The same idea applies to the way people understand themselves. Struggles, disappointments, or limitations that happened in the past may have been real when they occurred. But those moments were never meant to become lifelong definitions of who the person must remain. When someone keeps defending an outdated identity, they behave as though the past has the authority to decide what the future will look like. Old evidence ends up shaping new decisions. Because of that, opportunities that belong to the present moment often get judged according to conditions that no longer exist. Letting go of the old identity changes that relationship with the past. Instead of treating earlier experiences like permanent definitions, the person begins seeing them as information that helps shape their development. The lessons stay, but the obligation to keep repeating the same description disappears. At first, this shift can feel unfamiliar. The old story may have been repeated for years, so the mind is used to describing the person according to that narrative. When someone begins responding to life based on their current abilities instead of their old limitations, it can feel like stepping into territory they haven't explored before. But that unfamiliar feeling is often a sign that growth is happening. The person is no longer organizing their choices around the identity they once protected. Instead, they're allowing their present ability to guide their decisions. Each new action becomes evidence of who they're becoming, rather than proof of who they used to be. Progress often begins quietly through this shift in perspective. Someone who once avoided responsibility might begin accepting small chances to contribute. A person who once doubted their ability to lead may start guiding others in simple situations. None of these changes require big announcements or dramatic declarations. They simply reflect a willingness to respond to the present instead of staying tied to an old story. Over time, behavior naturally starts reshaping identity. When someone repeatedly acts in ways that match their growing abilities, the way they describe themselves begins to change. Confidence develops through experience. Skill improves through practice. Gradually, the identity a person carries begins matching the reality of what they are actually doing in everyday life. This process reveals something important about personal development. Identity doesn't have to be protected like something fragile. Instead, it can be allowed to grow and adapt as the person gains new experiences and deeper understanding. When identity stays flexible like this, it becomes a reflection of growth instead of a barrier that blocks it. Many people spend years defending who they used to be without realizing they've already moved beyond that description. The moment they stop protecting that old story, they begin seeing possibilities that were hidden before. Opportunities that once seemed inconsistent with their identity suddenly feel completely reasonable. Eventually, the person starts to recognize that the limits they once believed were permanent were really just patterns of thought repeated over time. Once those patterns begin to loosen, they gain the freedom to respond to life according to who they are today instead of who they once believed they had to remain. From that point forward, the future begins opening in small but meaningful ways. Decisions become guided by current ability rather than past hesitation. Opportunities are judged based on possibility rather than by the boundaries of an outdated identity. The person begins participating more actively in shaping the direction their life can take. So remember, Growth often begins with a simple realization. A person doesn't need to keep defending a version of themselves that belonged to another time. They can acknowledge the past without being confined by it. Once that understanding becomes clear, they are free to allow their identity to evolve along with the person they are continuing to become.